student, what is the framing? I think the first thing that we have to note is that Western countries are becoming increasingly right-wing. The way in which this pans out is three ways. The first thing is that you can see that empirically voting in these countries has become increasingly right-wing. And you see that the people buy into the MAGA ideology, which really basically means that make white people great again, or that you have increasing right-wing political sentiment in Europe, where you see in Italy, where you see in UK, where you see in Netherlands, etc., which means that at all points in time, the way in which populist sentiment occurs is that they're becoming increasingly conservative. The second thing is that there's been an increasing pattern of racism against Asians post-COVID, which means that you see this especially where you throw them out of public spaces because of the fact they're Asian, and you feel that your close family died because of some virus that they propagated, or that you go ahead and harass them and assault them in public places. You literally go ahead and just go ahead and physically assault them at all points in time. We do not want this. The third, and this happens in colleges especially because of the fact that you have lesser regulation mechanisms or lesser ways to keep more powerful people in check. The third thing is that the way in which the job market operates right now in the Western world is that you're more protectionist towards your own people, which means that you go ahead and do racial profiling. You go ahead and actively discriminate against people, but even if they're probably citizens, even if they're probably not ethnic majority, you still are less reluctant to give them jobs, which means that at all points in time, it's far more harder for people who are probably not from that same country, or even if they are, if they're going to be ethnically different from the majority, it's harder for them to give, it's just simply harder for them to get jobs. Which means that, with this as the framing, what are the incentives for the student and why is this extremely important? I think two things. The first thing is that the student probably wants a really successful career, but secondly, he probably wants a good college life. The first thing on employability and the reason for why you probably want a successful career, I think at all points in time, if you probably have offers from top Western Chinese universities, it means that you work really hard. It's not easy for you to get into it's not easy for you to get into top universities. You need to have a perfect scores throughout your entire high school in order for you to get options, in order for you to get admission from Western universities. You need to work really hard to crack the Chinese entrance exam in order for you to probably get offers from Peking or top Chinese universities. Which means the idea is that you work extremely hard, which is why you probably want a successful career. The second thing is that there is an increase in overpopulation in China, which means that the idea is that you probably want to be the best of the best. Why is this likely for this particular person? Notice that this person is probably not the average student that you see, is probably a top 1%, which means that you're going to be extremely disciplined and sort of work ethic that you come into, which means you have a set number of hours where you study, a set number of hours that you probably dedicate to your extracurricular activities, etc., which means that at all points in time, the idea of you working towards your career is the discipline that you probably implemented throughout to get into college is something that you probably implement throughout your college life as well. But the third thing then is that you compete for resources actively. Notice that I think it's a reasonable assumption that we take that this person is probably going to be middle class, which means that you've also seen the sacrifices that your parents make. They work long hours, they probably don't come back home, they probably sacrifice their weekends so that they can work their ass off, so that they can have money to send you to expensive coaching in order for them to get you private tutoring, so that you can go ahead and get some sort of admission. Which means that at all points in time, you probably think that you have so at that point in time, you still have this inherent need for you to be successful. The last thing then is that Chinese upbringing itself goes ahead and emphasizes that individuals must be successful in their life, which means it's an inherent drive for people within that society or within that community. This is the culture that they brought up in, which means that at all points in time, it's an inherent drive for people to want to be successful. This is the reason as to why this person has individual isolated incentives for wanting a successful career. But the last thing then, it's harder for you to get something like a work visa for Western universities. It's harder for you to get a H1B visa, which means that at all points in time, the chances of you getting a job probably is going to be uncertain because of all the reasons for conservatism that I've given. But secondly, it's harder for you to get work visa, etc., because of fluctuating government policies that go ahead and dictate these are the sorts of measures that you need in order for you to get a visa, etc., which means that at all points in time, for you to stay in China is just better, because the certainty of you getting a job is just more better. And at the end of this analysis, I just want to point out also that the cost of you to probably spend your time in Western countries is also going to be expensive, which means that you have an additional incentive of probably not wanting to graduate with student debt, which means that at all points in time, you don't want to spend 15 or 20 years paying off your student debt, and that's the only reason as to why you're working, which means that at all points in time, you have incentive incentives to like have like a very good job in 10 seconds. But secondly, as why you probably want like a good quality of life in college. The first thing that you note here is that you're probably really young, which means that you have like some sort of like positive expectation from life in terms of like wanting to make friends, in terms of wanting to have your own friend groups, in terms of like having like your own community that you can probably go ahead and talk to. This is extremely important because notice that college is a new environment and you probably really need some sort of like social capital in order for you to enjoy life. Which means that at all points in time, you don't want to get discriminated by race. You don't want to get discriminated by that slightly funny English accent that you talk to whenever you're talking to your friends. You don't want people to call your food smelly. You don't want people to go ahead and discriminate by the sort of culture that you choose to practice. Which means that at all points in time, it's incredibly important for you to have like a good friend system for that.
Which university filed a case against the Trump administration?
Oh, Western universities, but that's right. Okay, so that's an increase in liberalism within Western universities. But secondly, about like good quality of life and why it's extremely important. It means that at all points in time you probably want to like have like a good friend group, which means that at all points in time you don't want to forcefully change the daily habits that you're probably accustomed to, which means that at all points in time you probably just want to be freer, you want to enjoy what you have, like what you've already had, and that's the sort of like comfort level that you probably want. But lastly about like, it's just like a slight preemption as to why like this person will probably get a job and why he's probably not sacrificing a huge amount, like the opportunity cost is just very less. I think the first thing to note is that China like politically might be communist, but the way in which like the economy operates is like much more like capitalistic in nature, which means they push for companies to go ahead and be as profitable as possible. They push for more exports, which means that more like just like heavily business centric to begin with. Which means that at all points in time you have massive companies. It means you have companies that are breakthrough in all sectors. In terms of like AI, you have DeepSeek, you have HSBC in banking. Which means that at all points in time you still have really good companies that are probably pan-Asia and like also like they have they have breakthrough in the global sphere. Which means that at all points in time the fact that this person would get a good job for all those reasons.
How is this decision made? We think that the way this actor is likely to make this decision is first they'll obviously spend a lot of time in making this decision. They'll actually think about the places they can go and the universities that they can choose. Because the thing that they'll miss out on is that obviously like the West is not one general entity, it's a bunch of entities, it's a bunch of countries, it's Europe, it's USA, it's a lot of other places. Which means what are the factors you use to choose this decision? The first thing you choose is you obviously see the course or stream that you want to choose. So if physics is good in Germany and physics is better in Germany than China because of the universities that they have, or if it's in Sweden, it's better in Sweden, you choose places like that. But if you think social sciences is better in somewhere else in Europe, you choose places like that if you want to pursue social science. Or if you want to pursue other things, you basically see which country you want to go for. But the second thing that you want to choose is obviously you have discrimination and racism as a preemptive factor there. So you already see the waves in which discrimination or racism is happening here. Then we need to singularly explain why it's not just limited to America, why anti-China sentiments are not just limited to America, why they're rising throughout Europe. And even when they say this, they say that, oh, anti-immigration statements are rising. We don't think the anti-immigration statements are linked to Chinese immigrants in the first place, right? It's not about high-skilled people who are coming and taking high-skilled jobs. It's often about low-skilled workers who are coming, and that is what is raising these anti-immigration sentiments. We don't think they can just generalize the West and say that all of West is anti-EU. I think it's mostly US, and we're fine to take the trade-off even if it is US later on. What is the first thing they say though? We agree with this, that the person wants to find safety, but they don't explain what the person wants to find safety from, because they analyze the actor as a robot. They analyze this actor as a heavily disciplined machine that constantly feeds the same routine, that has a constant drive for success and is constantly succeeding. But the thing that they miss out on is obviously in the chase of success, there are moments of vulnerability. There are moments where you feel like shit. There are moments where you think you are likely to fail, and you think about the consequences of what is going to happen when people around you who are your community constantly tell you that you're failing, constantly tell you that you're not doing your best, constantly tell you that you need to perform better at Gaokao so you can go to a better university. Why are your test scores decreasing over time? What is happening to your test scores? Why are you spending your time playing? There are constant narratives that those are the things that you want to find safety from. What is the first thing that we want to run at opposition at the top of it? We want to explain that the thing that you want to find safety from and the thing that you want to confine away from and escape escape from is not just the fact that you might be discriminated against, but it's the fact that you are under a constant surge of pressure, that you're under a constant threat of being told that you might be underperforming, that you might not meet our expectations, that you might go ahead and become like a worse asset than we thought of you in the first place. Why does this person particularly resent the Chinese academic culture and want to have escape from this? There are 5 things under this. The first is that throughout your childhood, when you've been growing up, you've constantly had the parental overreach in your life, which means your parents that gauge their own respect within the Chinese community about how their children perform, what kind of colleges they go to, what kind of colleges their peers' children go to, and what kind of communities they come from, whether their children succeed or not, constantly overreach into your life and constantly have told you that you need to perform better, that you need to constantly perform, and that you need to have a constant bar of success for you, which means that it is internalized into you that the point at which you will fail at any circumstance, you will receive immense backlash from your parents, you will receive grounding from your parents, you will not receive the same amounts of good benefits that your parents would have alternatively given you in the first place because your parents want you to succeed. The second thing is that you are constantly wired for respect, which is to say, while your parents might love you on either sides of the house, they constantly attach respect, giving respect to you on conditions, which is to say, your community tells you that you need to be the topper of the class. That is the condition at which you will be respected within these communities. This is especially true for high performers. It might not be true for low performers, because with low performers, communities adjust their expectations. But with high performers, the expectations compound, which is to say, you've been the topper in school, you need to be the topper in college, you need to be the topper in university, you also need to be the person that has that ends up earning the most, which means your communal expectations towards you keep adjusting upwards instead of downwards because of you trying to fulfill those expectations in the first place. The third thing under this is that you obviously need to succeed on multiple things, and they just randomly say this. They say that, oh, you're probably good at extracurriculars. That's not true. It's not that you're good at extracurriculars. It's that you have been forced to do extracurriculars throughout your life, which is to say you have been forced to become the best pianist in your class as well. That is to say you have been forced to play sports, you have been forced to go ahead and try out a lot of things, which means that you did not have choice in what thing that you wanted to do. It was in terms of what gives you the best social value and what gives you the best C value in the first place, which means you've constantly been doing things in your life that you did not even like, that you've been constantly trying to be a pianist without even thinking that playing the piano adds value to your life, just because your community or parents attach social value to these things, which is why you dislike the fact that you have been constantly doing things that you did not have the freedom to choose. The last thing to know within this is obviously Gao, and they just flicker over this. Obviously, the way this works is that this person is not insanely confident or it's obviously still a normal person and feels like normal feelings. Which is to say, even if you're a successful man, even if you're top 1%, that does not mean you constantly think you're always going to succeed.
Yeah.
Which means you've been going through the immense pressure of Gao in the first place. Go on.
Yeah, do people in Harvard and Stanford not feel pressure when compared to a key university?
This is not about the university pressure. It's about the pressure that your community puts on you when you've been brought upon within these values and when they're close to you. Obviously, the comparative is your community is not as close to you. It cannot put the same level of pressure that you've been under in the first place. But also, your community cannot micromanage your decisions anymore. Your community cannot constantly tell you that spending your time playing video games is wrong in the first place because you need to focus on your university, which is what gives you more freedom. But Gao means you've been constantly under the duress of coaching, which is to say that does not mean you've been brainwashed and think that coaching is the best thing. That obviously still means you constantly keep questioning yourself about whether am I going to fail later on, whether I'm going to fail in the next decision I make. What does all of this explain? This explains that this person is incredibly fed up and incredibly burned out from the Chinese academic culture. And it is the academic culture that they want to escape in the first part of their explanation in the first place. Why is this a more important motivating factor than racism or discrimination, which Abdul will deal with later on anyway? This is a bigger motivating factor than racism because obviously this is a decision that is the most urgent for this person. Right?
I'll take a few. I refer to the
starting. Starting on a self count of 3, 2, and 1. Even if a certain couple of universities appeal for better immigration laws, it doesn't change the nature of students that come to these universities and actively study, because they come from different backgrounds with different standards probably at the end of the day. But I just also want to talk about what these anti-immigration sentiments actually look like for these people. It does exist because of very visible America-China tensions that exist even today. There are a lot of sentiments against a lot of the Chinese population, especially the MAGA supporters in the first place. But secondly, there's a visible assumption of white-collar jobs by most Chinese workforce, which causes a high degree of hatred. Even if not outright hatred, there's a lot of dislike or discontentment within most white-collar American people, because they don't have that job, because they can't compete with an average Chinese dude for the same job in the first place. So there's likely a lot of hatred regarding that as well. But thirdly, because of Sudiksha's analysis, there's already a great deal of blaming for COVID and other kinds of issues also, which probably a lot of people still blame onto a large number of Chinese individuals in the first place. There's a high degree of anti-Chinese sentiment that exists anyways in status quo for the generic American population at large. But secondly, there's a constant, so they tell you that there's a constant surge of pressure with regards to Chinese universities, but not for American universities. This is highly untrue, because most universities like Harvard and Stanford still have to uphold a high degree of standard with regards to the quality of students that they output on a yearly basis anyways, which means, one, they force their students to compete super hard anyways, but secondly, a lot of the students that end up coming into Harvard and Stanford are probably from richer backgrounds anyways, so they are held to the same kind of standard with regards to getting good grades or doing well in polo and things like that in the first place. Which means the kind of pressure is likely to be very similar on both sides of the world anyway. And recognize this, we're talking about the top universities in both sides of the country, which means it's unfair for them to say that most Harvard and Stanford students don't feel the same level of tension or pressure as much as an average speaking university student in the first place. But the third thing that I talk about is on how you have a constant need to vie for more amounts of respect. It is unclear whether this changes on their side. Because one, if parents still ask you for your grades, even if you're working in America and things like that in the first place, it's unclear the extent to which you can opt out of that pressure anyways. But secondly, right, in most instances, if these students look for validation to their parents or to their society at large, that doesn't really change even if you move to an American university, which means the extent of validation that you get because of terrible grades will be the same on both sides of the world. But lastly, right, if they're saying that you're so heavily ingrained in the notion of bringing your family respect and fame and culture and things like that, then presumably that doesn't change even if after school you go to a university, because there's the same level of ingrainment that you're actually going to a foreign university with. So it's unclear why that culture just changes all of a sudden so much in terms of your predisposition towards trying to get respect to your parents and your community in the first place. Extent of delta, at least as a first speech, is highly important. I just want to talk about exactly why it is why is China perfectly fine to live in. The first is on an economic perspective, as Sudiksha very well explains to you. The first with regards to how there's a large number of Chinese conglomerates that work in different kinds of sectors anyways. Most of these companies aren't heavily reliant on the Chinese economy. They work all across the Southeast Asian economy as well, and along with a large amount of global presence in the first place. Which means, one, there's adequate amount of job opportunities that you have access to if you work in a Chinese university, if you study in a Chinese university. But secondly, right, so there are a lot of opportunities, and these opportunities are likely to be pretty safe and pretty prestigious in the first place, because a lot of these companies are front runners in that industry in the first place. But secondly, right, in most instances, just because China is seen as a communist actor, in most instances they're very capitalist with regards to how they run their companies in the first place, which means you actively give more amounts of money if you do better work in these places. So if you have a higher position of responsibility, you inevitably end up making more money at the end of the day. This is oftentimes done to incentivize better quality of workers in the first place, or to invite higher quality talent in these companies in the first place. So positively to you, why, even if you are in China, you have a higher capacity, you have a good capacity to make good money and have good employment opportunities in the first place. I just want to quickly deal with social factors there, because that seems to be the chunk of their case. Tiger parenting is likely to be washed within this particular round. There's 3 reasons. If the extent of number one is if the extent of tiger parenting is that hard, then presumably the amount of micromanaging that a parent would want to do to their child would still exist. This will probably look like them actively going and living or relocating to the US, or secondly probably calling their child on a daily basis and actively pestering them with regards to how their studies are going and things like that. So the extent of tiger parenting, if it's that high, won't really change all of a sudden. But secondly, in China, most individuals don't live in close vicinity of like their university and things like that, which means the extent on our side for you to escape some degree of tiger parenting is just as high, because you're probably moving to a different city, which is probably a lot more farther, which means the extent of control can be a lot more mitigated even on our side as well. The third thing on this is that even in our worst case, if you're a high performing student with controlling parents, it is unclear why having the same level of controlling parents is likely to hamper your productivity significantly as a student at the end of the day. Because in status quo, you are able to get sufficient amount of good quality offers from good colleges while having tiger parents or having highly micromanaging parents, which means the ability for you to manage under that kind of duress and under that kind of pressure is just as high, which means quality of performance doesn't really change much, quality of happiness doesn't really change as much. But the most best and likeliest of cases is twofold. One is that in most instances, parents actually care for their kids. They're very hospitable, they sacrifice a lot for the benefit of their children at the end of the day. But secondly, most parents don't want to make their child more resentful of them, which is why they probably give them a reasonable amount of freedom and they provide a good amount of support system and actually be nice to these kids on a day-to-day basis anyways. And this is a more charitable explanation of what parents are like in the grand scheme of things, regardless of social pressures and things like that. Before moving on to our positive, I take a few items.
So parents have obviously been indoctrinated by the culture that exists in China. When you have to prepare for the how you get selected, obviously your parent becomes influenced.
Yeah, so you already prepared for the Gao. This is about after you've gotten those offers, so you've already gotten those college offers. I'm going to tell you now where the extent of delta lies on our side. The biggest and most important impact is on support system. We think that the likelihood of at least a few friends coming to this university, if it's in China, is likely to be a lot more higher simply by virtue of accessibility, geographically and financially at the end of the day. So preservation of support system is likely to be a lot more higher. But secondly, most friend groups require a significant amount of commonality, which means that if you have a difference in culture, religion and media, that inherently implies that you have differences in interests at the end of the day. In status quo, it is highly difficult for you to actively make friends because one, you just entered into your undergraduate, which means you still there's still a high fear of judgment, judgmental behavior from your peers, so you don't want to be that outward and things like that. But secondly, right, it requires a lot of effort and time you have to actually go out there and make new friends and talk to individuals and things like that. If you're a high performing student, in most instances you don't find this to be a worth it trade-off in the first place. And so as a result of that, you end up having to sacrifice on a lot of support system on their side of the world. In the absence of commonality, for all those reasons, we have better support system.
Thank you, the Deputy Prime Minister, for the very fine speech. Now, back to the Deputy Leader of the Student.
First of all, apologies to say that I was well mentioned. Abdul, he has to take you as I'm going to talk about three things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about pressure, then I'm going to talk about job and employment, and finally, I'm going to talk about what happens with regards to discrimination. First, let's talk about pressure. They try to criticize this claim and say that it will happen on our side as well. The pressure in Harvard and Stanford is obviously low. The first reason for this is that the vast majority of these specific institutions focus a lot on the co-curricular activities. The way in which they grade the vast majority of their students is fairly different. They think about other sorts of skill sets that you need to have. So obviously, you don't have a lot of academic focus. You don't just need to read books. That's the first layer of difference. But even if, let's just say, their net is correct and the pressure is symmetric, the amount of mental health discussions that happen in the vast majority of these universities are far better. So on their side of the house, when there's so much indoctrination that has happened because of the vast majority of the population of China, this is something that has become normalized. It is normal to work 24/7. It is normal to go to a coaching institute after your school. All of these sorts of things become far more normal. Think about it in the context of India, right? When you have the IIT, the vast majority of people are preparing for it. It's obviously such a bad culture, but it has been normalized. It's an industry that has been growing for the longest period of time. This is a symmetric thing that exists in China. Think about the coaching industry in China that has existed for the longest period of time. The third thing they say is that parents on our side of the house can still ask you for your grades, you can still chase validation from your parents. But this is obviously not engaging with our argument, right? Because obviously there's a difference between your parent micromanaging you every single second and a parent asking you what was your grade in this exam. On their side of the house, every single time you take a break, every single time you go out on a fun Friday with your friends, your parent asks you what you're doing. On our side of the house, that parent is not present, and obviously you have more decision-making capacity on our side of the house. The final thing that they say is that parents can come to you, and if time of parenting is so extreme, they will just come to you as and try to control you. Obviously, this is not true. They don't have the capacity to do it. How do you have the monetary ability to go and sustain your life in China? In the US and the West is something that they have to explain. But more importantly, they miss out on the POI that we explained, that we asked quite clearly in DPM. We tell you that the vast majority of people who've been indoctrinated don't realize the sorts of hurts they inflict on their child. So yes, maybe parents have the incentives to not inflict hurt, but do those incentives even exist when they've been indoctrinated to such a large extent is something that they don't understand. The most important thing to note here is that the culture that we describe in NO exists in China. The vast majority of those people have been persuaded by that culture. They've normalized that culture on day-to-day level. And when the normalization exists to such a large extent, the vast majority of parents don't even recognize that their children are going through such a downtrodden time. What is the weighing of this pressure argument in the first place? The first thing that we explain is that the idea of pressure has consumed you for the longest period of time in history. Think about it. Since you were a young kid, since you went to school, since you went to kindergarten, it's something that has been consistently around you. Things like job and employment might have been crucial factors for you, but these are factors that have probably become prominent when you grew older. These were not factors that were there for you and were important for you when you were younger. Insofar, this has been a narrative which has been transgenerational and has affected you for such a long period of time. This is obviously something that affects you the most. But the second thing to note with regards to the weighing of this metric is compounding. On their side of the house, this is a culture that exists 24/7. It eats you up again and again. While the difference on our side is that it exists only for a short period of time. This is why this metric is so important. Because maybe jobs and employments and things like that can affect you. Maybe it affects you for 10 years and ultimately you end up switching your job. Maybe you don't get into the best possible job, but considering that you're a top tier student in that university, you get in somewhere, right? But insofar as this impact is consistently affects you, it's the most important metric on which you judge it. This is why we will not pressure. Now let's talk about discrimination, right? And this is something they run in their first page and then drop it in DPM for some reason. They say that the vast majority of Western countries are right-wing and therefore there's going to be discrimination. This is why we ask the POI. Just because the vast majority of Western countries are right-wing does not imply that the vast majority of Western universities are right-wing. If anything, I will prove the flip. There are 5 reasons why this is true. The first reason for why Western universities have gotten far more progressive is because they wanted to go ahead and protest against the Trump administration. The structural reason behind this is that the Western universities and their research, which was actively being funded by left liberal scholars, was getting damaged. These Western universities had incentives to go ahead and file lawsuits. This is why Harvard filed a lawsuit against Trump. But the third thing to note is that the vast majority of these Western universities also get funding from endowments, also get funding from alumni donations. The vast majority of these alumni went ahead and graduated out of these universities far earlier, and therefore they're left-leaning individuals who care about what sort of values are implemented. The third thing to note is that MAGA fascism is also occurred, so I would agree this argument would make sense in early 2025 or mid 2025, but we're in early 2026. I don't think this works right now. The vast majority of support for the Trump administration is reduced. We know this because early polling votes that exist and polling results that exist for the midterm elections that are coming up in November show that the vast majority of people are not happy with right-wing nationalism. They're not happy voting for Trump because the cost of inflation has increased. The vast majority of jobs on a day-to-day level have gone far worse. So I'm not really sure why this is necessarily the true case. The conclusion of this is simple. The vast majority of these universities are not as extreme as they say. What is the impact? Firstly, they concede that on our side of the house, these Western universities have lots of cultures, have lots of people from different cultures.
Switch on motor.
You have lots of communities for immigrants. Think about it in the context of Delhi University. The vast majority of Delhi University colleges have Northeast Indian clubs where the vast majority of students that are coming from Northeast India consistently engage with their own community, consistently find solace in those communities. But the third thing to note is that when you have lots of diverse communities, they are willing to listen to your story. And this is where we completely flip that thing. When you've lived in China under an autocratic regime, you have never had the capacity to express yourself. You never had the ability to go ahead and talk about your thoughts. You always fear that there's somebody listening. You always fear that state crackdown will happen. The vast majority of people around you are indoctrinated by state nationalists who can't even express yourself. It's only on our side where you actually can go ahead and talk to liberal people and talk about all sorts of problems that exist on you. This is why we quite clearly went on discrimination. Before I go on to employment, do you have a view?
Yeah. Do you spend all of your time only on campus?
Vast majority of it, yes. Vast majority of it engaging with different people. Vast majority of it going to restaurants and pubs with them. Vast majority of it engaging with people on a day-to-day level of co-curricular activities. I don't really think this matters. If anything, you're actually proving my point because you're proving that the vast majority of these people can interact in different spaces, which makes their minds even freer, so less discrimination happens. Okay, job and employment. Why do you feel on that? The first thing they say is that race profiling will happen and you won't get admission into a good university. Firstly, the vast majority of the top tier universities have top tier recruiters that care more about profits and talent and don't care about racism. The vast majority of them would hire Chinese mathematicians to work in hedge funds because they know that Chinese mathematicians are really good at what they do. The second thing that they say is work visas don't exist, H1B visas don't exist. Yes, they don't exist for the average population, but not for this actor who is very, very smart, who is very, very capable. H1B visas will be sponsored for this actor. The third thing they say is student debt, and I want to completely flip this. They say that the student debt is going to be far worse on our side. It's far worse on their side. Why? Firstly, the loan market, the credit card loan market was cracked down by Trump. Interest rates have been capped at a specific level. This is average AIB knowledge which literally took place 6 weeks ago. But secondly, flip this argument. What happens in China? In China, you have a shadow banking system where the vast majority of banks are not privatized. These are local banks that exist on a local level. They are the ones that offer you student loans, which can go ahead and offer you much higher interest rates. But thirdly, currency exchange volatility also exists. The fact that the Chinese yuan is far more vulnerable to currency exchanges and that banks can increase their interest rates far much on their side of the house. At that point in time, you do not have any capacity to get any jobs. Jobs are far better.
about that sort of interaction that you've had negatively. This takes up a significant amount of space
in your life and affects your productivity. This directly clashes against Abdul's analysis on why community pressure constantly is actively tiring for you. We think that this sort of fear that you experience within this new environment is also likely to be extremely harmful in terms of your productivity or ability to study or actual ability to enjoy college life and things like that. On community pressure level, we think high-performance universities in every country are extremely pressurizing. Firstly, because of the long journeys that students have had to take to get into that university. You've had to have a roster of extracurricular activities that you have to give multiple amounts of time to. You have to sacrifice on social gatherings, friendships, and things like that. And lastly, you just have to study your butt off to get into these universities, regardless of whether you're an American or a Chinese. That means the pressure to succeed or the pressure of being in a high-performing community is also existing even on their side of the paradigm. Fees are extremely high. That means as a Chinese student, if I'm giving like 2 crores to go and get an undergrad education, I at least want to be sure about getting a job. That pressure of getting a job is extremely high in nature. That means I'm unsure as to what sort of exclusive, chill environment they're talking that this kid is going to get in that region. But lastly, they tell you that Western universities have more extracurricular activities and things like that. I'm unsure as to why that's true because when global rankings of universities come down, they're actually in terms of the amount of research that's been undertaken, how many times their authors have actually been cited, how much of the job placement, CPC and things like that. Jobs look at your extracurriculars because they don't just want to hire another robot. So I think the emphasis that's given to extracurricular and overall well-rounded development of individuals is likely to happen in top universities of both countries. I think the sort of the difference that they're talking in education is actually within the schooling system, which this person has come out of. Not at this point in time, I beat a very toxic system. I cracked the guppa. I actually got into the top university. That sort of motivation actually makes me want to capitalize on this community that I'm already a leader of. That means I've beat the system. I want to make people are praising me, right? You're such an amazing Chinese person. Why would I want to leave that? My family is praising me. My teachers in school are praising me. My friends are jealous of me. Of course, I still want to go into this Chinese college that I've worked so hard to crack.
The CCP tells you that the West is bad.
Okay, on this thing, on colleges being liberal, sorry, on liberal. So I don't care if my university is liberal and things like that, student problems are happening. At the end of the day, I have to live in that country. If I'm going into that university, I have to get a job which is majorly going to be from that country itself, because majority of the companies look into their own country's universities to hire by virtue of cultural alignment and things like that, which means Western universities probably get more placements from Western companies as opposed to Chinese companies. At that point in time, my goal then, if I have to get a placement, I have to live in that country. So I don't care if within the university itself protests are happening and things like that. At the end of the day, I have to still live within that country. So sure, students are liberal, but the population at large is extremely conservative in nature. Shopkeepers are extremely conservative. They don't sell stuff to me because I look different, or they don't sell stuff to me because I can't pronounce it naturally and things like that. Lastly, if China is autocratic and actually university can't say anything, I'm a high-performing Chinese person. I'm literally what China propagates. I'm literally the poster boy for China. Why do I care about China cracking down and things like that? So at all points in time, all of their harms about China being autocratic, community being extremely stressful is something. Community being stressful is very symmetric. Career success is the most important. You sacrifice a lot to get to this level. You want to become rich to make your parents proud, which exists on either side of the paradigm. We think he's rational enough to understand that he's better off to get a job over here as opposed to in a foreign land he knows nothing about. For all of those reasons, he will choose to stay in China.
Thank you for the argument for that nice speech. Now I'm going to talk to Shubhir to go to China's speech.
Yeah, same UI preferences. Pop web this time. The problem with this property is that they choose to not engage with the NL reasoning at all in terms of finding the pressure or other decisions they make. The first thing that they do is analyze the actor as a whole, which is to say that, oh, this person has been high performing till now. That particularly means that obviously they're going to continue to be high performing because they're disciplined or something like that. But what is the way the solution works, right? It's a a motion that requires the actor to take a decision at a certain point of time. What does this give you? The first thing is obviously the actor does not know what his circumstances will be in the future, which means they are unaware in terms of whether they're going to fail, whether they're going to pass, or whether they're going to succeed in the first place in the future while taking the decision in the first place. Which particularly means there can be a lot of reasons why the actor is still concerned about them, particularly failing later on in the first place because of the pressure and all of the other things. But the second thing to note here is obviously you're still scared of failure even though you've succeeded in the past, because that increases expectations even more, which means the definition of success from you changes because you are supposed to succeed even more given your previous successes in the past, which means the community expects you to do much more than what you've done in the past because you've done historically well in the past, which keeps expectations compounding. This is the explanation that they miss in terms of what the actor thinks the success will be within the community is something that keeps increasing over time, and the expectations keep constantly increasing over time, which is why obviously the actor is afraid of pressure because the actor is afraid of whether or not they're going to be able to match those expectations raising over time. But obviously in the instances, because future is uncertain, in the instances where you fail, you still want to retain your ability to be happy because there will be some failures, some losses that you will have to take in the past, in the future, which means you want to recover or keep your ability of recovering from failure higher at a point in time where you don't face the same levels of pressure and you don't constantly feel your community telling you that you're failing or that you failed or that you've lost all our expectations and you've lost our respect in the first place. The first thing I want to do, however, quite briefly, is I want to explain why the strategy of symmetrizing pressure does not work and explain what the margin of pressure is quite cleanly and actually weigh the margin of pressure against the claims that they have. The first reason why there is a clear margin of pressure is notice how these universities operate. Because the only reasoning they've given you is these universities are also high-level universities, which is why they will keep imposing the same amounts of pressure. But this isn't. This is a competing reason, but the competing reason does not explain extent. The first thing we do in our explanation is we explain the extent of pressure that is created through the communities surrounding you. So the pressure that comes from work is not pressure of just you performing, but the pressure of your community constantly telling you that you're not performing, that you're spending your time wrong, which means there's a much more deeper pressure on you because that pressure is continuous. This pressure only comes on you at the times of exams, at the times where your exams are nearby you. But the pressure that we point out in terms of your community constantly telling you, constantly reminding you of all of these things is continuous. It comes on every day because every day you're told that you might fill in you might fill in other things at a point in time where you're not constantly putting in the work or where you're slacking off or something like that. Which means you cannot take breaks for depression. Which means you cannot go off from your studies because you're burnt out or something like that. Because that is the point of time where your community thinks that they lose confidence in you and things like that. Which is what the first clear reason why there's a margin on pressure. The second clear reason why there's a margin on pressure is also in terms of how the universities operate. The universities in West do not have a written entrance exam that you score really high in to get into it in the first place. Which means they have a diversity of factors. They see the social background you come from, they see the sports you played, they see the community work you've done, and a host of other things, instead of just seeing how well you can compete. Which is to say, notice the comparative reason of who comes into the Chinese universities compared to who comes into these Western universities. The people that come into the Chinese universities are people who have succeeded in a highly competitive entrance exam, which means that the Chinese universities self-select for people who are by their nature incredibly competitive and want to constantly outcompete you and do not want to help you, do not want to give you depression breaks, do not want to tell you that you are actually not doing that bad, you will do well in the future, because they want to make sure that they succeed themselves. These are the kinds of people that opt into Chinese universities. Compared to Western universities, where you have a lot more liberal people coming in, a lot more people who have done social work and look at the struggles of community. There are a lot more people who have had constant mental health discussions, which means your nature of conversations that you have with people and peers around you, which is the highest form of thing that you're constantly afraid of, constantly changes at a point in time where you're interacting with different people compared to interacting with just highly competitive people in the first place, which automatically explains that the vast majority of interactions that you're actually afraid of, which is you're actually afraid of failure. You're afraid of being outcompeted because your community member tells you that they're doing better from you or somebody else is doing better from you. Abdul is doing better from me, he's a better debater than me. If Abel keeps reminding me of it, that particularly means that I'm constantly afraid of failing in the first place, compared to me being in a safer space and being able to have mental health discussions and all of these things, which completely means that there's a clear margin of the kinds of pressure you face and when do you face that pressure. Go on.
I am still likely to fear the community backlash at the point in time I fail abroad and come back home. So the pressure is symmetric. I need to succeed even abroad to appease my community.
You're missing the way the argument works. If this person is going to fail, they're failing anyways, and they will feel the pressure of failure anyways. What particularly changes is the pressure is not continuous. It's not continuous in the process. It's contingent on the outcome. We think that the pressure on the process is continuous, and that is the clearest margin. But obviously, the pressure is also much lesser when they can't micromanage your actions, which means you're not constantly under the duress of failure, which increases your chances of failure because you become burnt out in the first place. Why is this clearly the debate-winning reason? Why does racism not work and other things that they point out not work? Obviously, this is a highly competent actor. Let's be clear, honest guys. This guy is going to get a job anyways. He's going to get a job on either side of the house. That these are capitalist companies. Capitalist companies are going to hire people, they're not going to discriminate people just because they're from China. Religion is working in like Jain Street for fuck's sake. Notice what the discrimination between metric is. Obviously, the way discrimination works is that there are a lot of Chinese immigrants within these spaces as well, because Chinese immigrants are huge in community colleges, which particularly means that you have a community to go back to. On the comparative, for pressure, you do not have a community to go back to, because your community is the one giving you the pressure, which means that you cannot opt out of pressure. You cannot escape from pressure because your community is giving you that pressure. But the second thing is, obviously, racism is short term, which is to say, you face a racist interaction right now, you have better interactions over time, but this pressure is continuous. You continuously feel that you are being watched. You continuously feel that you have to perform. Racism is at least short term. You can at least come out from it. But obviously, the point at which this decision is being made is the point at which the person is far closer to pressure they feel compared to racism. Very good.
No, there are fine. In writing the opposition,
Government is a great tool. Obviously, we also get well in this now, so there are lots of competing reasons in this debate, and probably a one which is a different way to do it. But the problem is that government bench does not complete their mechanisms in their own way. These are two things that we do on the basis of which there is a debate. Let's first go through the method of discrimination communication, why you should not give this debate, do them on the basis of this. The first thing they say is that you will not be accepted on our side, and the vast majority of people in the US voted for the Trump administration, the vast majority of them are racists. But the problem is that this is a logical leap, right? This is an incomplete mechanism. Just because the vast majority of people voted for him does not imply that the vast majority of top-tier students voted for him in Western universities. They never really analyze why it's these specific factors. As we quite clearly explained in both our speeches, the vast majority of these universities are liberal, the vast majority of communities within these universities are liberal, so I don't really see why this is something that changes. The second thing that they say is that you feel you're going to be indoctrinated, and this is the claim where they don't really take our viewpoint. They say that the CCP has told you that the West is bad, that the people within the West are struggling, that the students are getting discriminated. But as a young, curious student who used the VPN in China, you also saw the news that the CCP is killing a lot of people who are protesting against the CCP. You also saw that the CCP was cracking down on private companies and nationalizing them. When you consume the narrative that your government was an autocratic regime, I'm not really sure why you get indoctrinated by an actor that has actively oppressed you. And this is something which is persuasive to you, right? Because you've heard students, you've had these discussions with your students, and if anything, people in China consistently have discussions about how dangerous the CCP is. I'm not really sure why you get indoctrinated by the government to such a large extent. This is the PY that you were asking, that didn't engage me. The final thing that I would note is that with regards, so this is the reason for why discrimination is not something that exists on our side. We obviously give you mechanisms for why you can counteract it. In the worst possible case, there are going to be some people who discriminate against you, but obviously there will be some communities that you can go ahead and confide in. You spend the vast majority of your time there. You don't spend the vast majority of time with people who are racist. On pressure, and this is where the biggest margin really exists. We say that the vast majority of your life has been consumed in this country, which has pushed people to work as hard as possible. The reason for this is that this country has been incredibly populated. There is way too much competition. They say that once you crack the Gaga, you're going to become the poster boy, and people are going to be like, hey, you're the one who should get all success, you're the one who matters. That's the problem. Your parent will come and say that you can't relax right now. The reason for this is that your parents have been indoctrinated by this culture. This is what we explain very clearly in yellow. They never really engage with it. That the vast majority of parents work hard in university, they see the job markets, they see things like the news where they see that AI is disrupting the vast majority of the job market. I'm not really sure why they'll just relax and be like, hey, you've cracked the exam, now you can go ahead and go to sleep. Obviously, they're going to tell you that now you're even in a more competitive space and you need to work hard, you need to ensure that you go out and become the best. You've invested so much time and therefore you need to get the most out of it. Obviously, on our side of the house, universities are going to be competitive. Our claim is not that Harvard and Stanford are not competitive. Our claim is that the culture within those universities is far more diverse and far better in the way in which they approach academia. They don't just look at your research, they don't just look at your grades, they look at other sorts of activities that you do and the way in which you perform. They say that this is empirically untrue, that these universities are focused on research. I think that's just not really true. The vast majority of them do care about your performances and other things. But even if you think that pressure is symmetric, right, that pressure exists on both sides of the debate, the question is where are you able to express that pressure and have conversations? That clearly happens on our side because we illustrate that the mental health culture is far better in the US, where you have psychologists, where you have counselors, which is far less on their side of the house, where you have coaching industries that can lobby politicians and push for more specific work culture being ingrained in the vast majority of communities. The final thing that I will note is that they say that community appeasement needs to be done. This is the POI that they asked for Ansuman, that obviously you have to come back and you have to succeed. We clearly point out that you're not going to fail to such a large extent. Obviously, this is a good university. Obviously, you have alumni connections that can help you. But more importantly, Ansuman clearly replies to this by telling you that on their side, failure is far more likely when you're burnt out compared to our side where you get an opportunity to less. The final thing that I will explain is job and unemployment. I think this is just something that does not matter that way. The US has jobs, China has jobs as well. We're going to concede to that. But if anything, they don't respond to our student debt mechanism. They don't respond.
Switch off motor.
So if anything, you have less debt on our side, so we even will not jobs.
That means opposition plan. What means this?
Starting in 3, 2, and 1. The good thing about debating is that don't rely solely on the lines and mechanisms that they give you if it sounds bizarre as fuck. And I'm going to tell you why they're bizarre as fuck. Let's talk about the positive case there. First thing that they say is that you have lower pressure from your community. You have two mechanisms for this. The first is that because of distance, now presumably your parents won't try to micromanage you. They never engage with the frame, so the mechanism that we tell you that in most instances you are not going to be living at home anyways, which means the only way your parents can interact with you is via video call, in which case they can probably micromanage you equally on both sides of the world. So if distance was the metric, then it's unclear on why their parents' ability to micromanage is a lot more higher anyways. And a lot of the impacts with regards to parents constantly asking you, how did this test go? Are you studying? Are you not studying? Are you taking a break? Is all contingent on an assumption that you're living at home with your parents in the first place. It's unclear by the extent of micromanagement. There is a delta and it's minimized. But secondly, right, they tell you that, okay, if it's not this, then it's also about the difference in culture. This is where you have to gut check whatever they do. They tell you that, oh, because there is a huge society in China that focuses on like bringing pride to your family, you feel pressure. But there's an equally competitive capitalistic framework that exists in most American countries or European countries anyways. This is the analysis that comes from first speaker, which tells you that a lot of these Western universities rely on prestige. So if you're unable to score well in the exam, you feel you're falling back in the rat race anyways. This mechanism comes both in first and my speech when we talk to you about the importance of prestige and like pressure within foreign and Western universities anyways. So it's unclear, even if the kind of culture is different, the effect of that culture in terms of forming a pressure on an individual is unclear why that changes on either side of the world. Because if you don't do well in your placements, you can't become an investment banker even if you're in a foreign university, and if that was your dream all along, then you feel like you're fucked if you haven't landed that dream job anyways. So by virtue of capitalistic pressures and because of prestige related reasons for being in the topmost universities even in the West, it is unclear why the level of pressure is likely to be different on both sides of the world. Then they tell you that oh, at least you have mental health capabilities on their side. This directly engages, or you necessarily should weigh this with the arguments that we give you on your likelihood of making more friends on our side of the world. We are able to tell you for certain that because, and this is not just with regards to racism, this is with regards to you joining an undergraduate degree in a environment altogether, and people finding it difficult to make new friends because of not racism, but because you're simply different from each other. There's a higher hesitance with regards to actually making new friends, interacting, fear of being judged, and things like that. These are difficulties that we talked to you about with regards to how it is comparatively a lot more easier to actually make friends within China when there are individuals that share your same kinds of tastes and preferences in the first place. This is why we tell you your ability to make friends is a lot more higher when you stay within China. This you should weigh against what they tell you about mental health thing. Where is it more better for you if you first get fucked and then go to a therapist, or if you have friends all along and you're able to actually like voice out your concerns to your friends along the way? Better sense of support system, you should weigh this on your own. Don't let them get away with frivolous analysis anyways. What then is our positive that we tell you for certain? The first thing that we tell you is that your likelihood of having an actual support system is likely to be a lot higher, regardless of the pressure incentives that they give you. Because of what I've just told you, because of 3 speeches worth of analysis, you're able to know why it's a lot more easier for you as a student who is probably a lot more averse to newer kinds of environments because of the way media portrays it to you. You're likely to be able to make a lot of new friends. We've already talked to you what is the importance of making new friends and why it is explicitly more difficult to make new friends, especially when you're in a newer environment. All of this comes in my speech indefinitely. But as a result of that, the support system is likely to be a lot more guaranteed and a lot more beneficial for you on our side of the world. The second thing that we give you is our likelihood of employability. The employability difficulty that we tell you is with regards to individual hiring manager biases that people have on a day-to-day basis. So sure, capitalist itself can be very efficient, but it's at the end of the day on like basis of what that HR manager actually thinks of you at the end of the day. Which is if there's a lack of relatability, there's individual prejudices, you're unlikely to get hired anyways. We give you certain mechanisms, and more importantly, we give you gut checkable mechanisms that are actually worth doing. Very good.
And to the government guys.